So let's raise the big questions on that landslide Labour victory in the United Kingdom. What does this UK verdict really mean for the world in this big election year across the world? Is there anger, growing anger against the sitting governments across the globe? Remember, most sitting governments have either suffered a dip in popularity or lost elections in the last few months. Are economic hardships shaping world politics now? Liberals versus right wing, is that the nature of this battle, and what's next? Joining me now, Farooq Dondi, author and columnist, joins me from London. Navteej Sarna, former envoy to the United Kingdom, is with us. Sandeep Shastri, political scientist, tracks politics across India and the world. And Daniel Block, senior editor, Foreign Affairs magazine in New York. America goes to the polls in a few months from now. Let's come to you, Farooq Dondi, because you're our man in London at the moment. Are you surprised at the scale of the victory? 410 seats and counting, that kind of 400 par. We thought it would happen in India, it's happened in the UK. How do you explain the scale of Labour's victory?
It's not that Labour won the election. They did by over 172 votes, majority. It's that the Conservatives lost by doing all manner of things over the last 14 years. The first disaster they had was the populist Boris Johnson, who was caught lying on several fronts, including breaking the rules that he made himself during COVID. And when he lied to Parliament about it and was forced to resign, it gave a rise to a break in the Conservative Party. Even Rishi Sunak resigned and turned against Boris Johnson, and that began the demise of the Tory party. Secondly, they elected a person called Liz Truss, who's lost her seat yesterday or today, and she had the most awful, nonsensical plan for the growth of Britain by cutting taxes, increasing borrowing, and so on, and markets went wild. The cost of living went up. The share prices fell, and so she had to resign after 49 days. The most disastrous Tory, or the most disastrous period ever in British history. And then, of course, they got Rishi Sunak, who didn't do what the right wing wanted, and the right wing fell away, and he couldn't control immigration. He had a mad scheme about sending illegal immigrants to Rwanda, and his two secretaries, Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, and it's strange that all of them are Indians via Africa as immigrants and citizens of Britain. They all talked about this Rwanda plan, and it was branded as racist. And then somebody who was even more anti-immigrant, like the Reform Party and Nigel Farage, turned up, and they attacked the immigration plan and the NHS plans, which had gone wrong. So it was really a protest vote against the Tories.
So you're saying it's a protest vote against the Tories rather than so much an affirmation against of Labour. Remember, Labour's only got really 35% vote share. They've got a disproportionate number of seats. But Navteej Sarna, you heard Farooq Dondi. Give us a sense of a history of the last 10 years where the Tories have moved from one disaster to another. In a sense, is it the economy stupid, the failure to handle the economy in tough times across the world, given what's happened in Ukraine? We've COVID before that. This has been a tough period of 5 years, so incumbent governments are finding it difficult. Even Narendra Modi, who was expected to get 300 plus, eventually ended up at 240. At least he can claim he didn't lose.
Yes, thank you, Rajdeep. I agree with what Farooq has said. Only I would take it back a little further, because even under David Cameron, we saw, this completely whimsical idea of doing a Brexit referendum, which suddenly became a major issue and actually resulted in Brexit. And that itself divided not just Britain, but entirely the Conservative Party there. We saw a lot of backstabbing and skullduggery happening during that those Brexit days amongst the top echelons of the Conservative Party. And all that led to a lack of trust and a breakdown of what the Conservative was doing. Along with that was a breakdown of the entire system in the UK in terms of public services. People having to wait 2 years for a medical appointment at the NHS, people finding it a problem to travel on British Rail, a complete disaster in terms of public services, a very, very sluggish economy. Despite having broken off from Brexit and expecting this great rise in global Britain, Europe was growing at 4%, Britain is growing at 2%. So it was the economy, it was the scandals, it was the infighting amongst the Tories, and all that combined to make this an anti-incumbency feeling to beat all anti-incumbency feelings. And that's the result. You're right, the Labour share has only gone up about 2% in terms of vote share. But in terms of seats, it's the worst defeat the Tories have suffered for more than 100 years. So that's the history.
Both of you are referring to anti-incumbency, the mishandling of the economy. This is, of course, the Tories have been in power for 14 years. So, Sandeep Shastri, just bringing it back home and trying to extrapolate from what's happened there, because we had an election exactly a month ago. The general impression was that Prime Minister Modi would be even further strengthened. Instead, he's been diminished, got 240, but still won in terms of the fact the NDA has a majority. So he could well claim, unlike other parts of the world, and we're seeing what's happening in France. We saw the South African government also diminish a few weeks ago. Do you believe that Mr. Modi could turn around and say, look, in an age of anti-incumbency across the world, I've at least survived and lived to tell the tale?
You're right, Rajdeep, and the point you began with, that 400 plus came 1 month later and in a different country. And that is something that the UK election is about. And clearly, Mr. Modi would make the point that the BJP may have had reduced numbers, but the NDA was voted to power. And this has been the burden of the song that the NDA and its members have sung in the Lok Sabha, in the Thanksgiving address to the President. Rajdeep, if I could make 2 more points, I think I unequivocally support the points made till now, that the UK result is very clearly an anti-Tory vote and not necessarily a pro-Labour vote, especially if you look at the performance of the Liberal Democrats. Given the fact that in 14 years they had 5 prime ministers and the frequent change and the controversies associated with them, let's also remember that never in a UK election have 12 sitting ministers lost the election. I'm told the largest number in the past has been 4 ministers. And again, in the last 100 years, I'm told former prime minister has never lost the election. And this has happened in the UK this time. And I think the 3 issues which have been highlighted, which are relevant in the Indian context also, the economic crisis which is being faced by the UK, be it rising inflation, be it spiraling unemployment, I would believe that these are the 2 factors which resulted in the drop of the BJP from 306 to 204. So the economic crisis which actually did in the Tories in the UK was a factor in India too. The scandals which the Tories faced, be it on COVID-19, be it corruption, be it probity in office, I think were also relevant. And finally, the delivery of services, which was also referred to, where the system in the UK seems to have noticed a decline. And many would argue that in India also, in some of the states, the verdict that you saw in the Lok Sabha election was a reflection on the delivery of services. So I would draw a lot of parallels, and I would believe that some of the parallels do not match for India because the crisis was not so acute in that particular domain in the Indian context.
Particularly the economy in India, which has recovered far more sharply post-COVID than it did in the United Kingdom. But Daniel Block, you're joining us from New York. In November, we'll have the big presidential elections. Do you get any takeaways from what has happened in Britain? You've got an economy which is on the up, and despite that, the numbers are showing Biden trailing Trump. Is this a reflection of the debate that's going on over Biden's age? There's talk that he might even step down after that first debate and give way possibly to Kamala Harris or another candidate. But are there takeaways that sitting governments are on notice at the moment across the world, or is the US very different compared to what happened in the United Kingdom?
There are obviously a lot of differences between what's happening in the United Kingdom and what's happening in the United States. As you noted, our economy is quite a bit stronger than it is in the UK. At the same time, one thing that's quite consistent is inflation. Inflation has been high in the United States. It's been coming down, but there's still a sense across the country that prices have gone up.
Try and come back to you and get your audio fixed, Daniel, as early as possible. We are getting a bit of a hum sound. I'll come back to you in a moment. But Farooq Dhondi, we are listing out the various factors that have resulted in a landslide. You gave us an overarching picture. It almost seemed as if the Tories didn't do anything right. But do you get a sense across the world as we see pictures of Joe Biden and the Trump versus Biden battle that's upon us? What we saw in India, where the Prime Minister didn't get the kind of overwhelming majority, was expecting that whoever is in power at the moment is on notice because people are getting impatient on issues like inflation, on issues like unemployment. These are the two global problems that the world is facing. Farooq, can you hear me?
Sorry. You're asking me, Mr. Biden is hanging on by his, shoestring, I suppose, because the blunders that he made when speaking, he really doesn't seem quite fit for office. But the Democrats and his supporters and Jill Biden don't want him to resign, and he's facing great pressure to try and stay exactly where he is. Not that I see that the Democrats, with the Vice President, Kamala Harris, Kamala is not terribly popular. She hasn't been heard of since she became Vice President, and she will definitely replace Biden if he resigns. There are other contenders in the field, but the other contenders have to overcome Kamala's natural.
I'm just stopping you for a moment, Farooq, because Daniel Block joins us again. Let's get that American perspective from him. Daniel, we've been talking about the United Kingdom. What are the parallels you see with the US and what's different?
The biggest parallels are inflation and this general sense that's going around the world that incumbents are unpopular. Those are the two biggest parallels. People feel like prices have gone up, that they can afford less than they could even a few years ago, and that's made the incumbent government quite unpopular. But there are many differences. So one thing that's dragging down the approval of the Democratic Party, and really in particular Joe Biden, is Joe Biden himself. He's clearly quite old. The debate did him no favors because it exposed, I think, some of his limits. Interestingly, one thing we see is that the Democratic Party as a whole appears to be running ahead of Joe Biden. So if you look at competitive Senate races, the Democratic nominees there are doing better than Joe Biden is himself. So he, in some ways, may be dragging down the ticket. And obviously, the most obvious difference being, as you mentioned before, the economy in the United States is stronger than it is in the United Kingdom. And yet that may not be enough to overcome issues of inflation and just general unpopularity of incumbent governments.
Can I come though, Navteej Sarna, and maybe Farooq, you can also step into this, the belief that there is this cultural factor as well at play, that Trump is talking about America first. You've had the likes of the Reform Party in Britain talking about putting Britain's interests first above all else. And there is the sense that while the economy is one issue, there's also the issue of how do we define nationalism and our best interests. Do you believe that's a factor, Navteej Sarna, when you look at what's happened in Britain, the Reform Party showing signs of being on the rise?
Yes, Rajdeep, I'm glad you've touched this point, because I was hesitating to agree with your generalization that it is only the incumbent government factor that is a problem. There are several other issues. For instance, in the United States, there is a huge Trumpian bloc, which is this almost populist right, the kind of thing that's reflected in Nigel Farage's Reform Party and relative success in this election. At the same time, there is a rise in nationalism, hyper-nationalism. There is a rise in xenophobia in parts of Europe in terms of migrants and immigration.
We're seeing it in France, issue. If I may say so. We're seeing it in France, the possibility that Marine Le Pen may be in the fight.
Yeah. Yes, there is, for instance, there you don't see the economic issues so much. What you're seeing is an ideological divide. There is an ideological divide coming right across Europe. If you see the European Parliament elections as well, there are 6 countries in Europe out of the 27 of the EU which are ruled by far-right parties. And that is the kind of thing that Macron is trying to stem with this gamble. And, so there are ideological things. The economy, the inflation, the immigration issue, that has been more to the fore in the UK. In the United States, I think it's a far deeper divide. It's a cultural divide. It's a personality issue. And it is the system which has thrown up people like only Trump and Biden. It's a terrible choice. Today, 70% of registered voters in the US do not want Biden. 50% of the registered voters don't want Trump. But that's what they're saddled with. So, there are several factors. It would be difficult to generalize simply on the basis of incumbency.
Point taken. Farooq Dhondi, do you believe there's a cultural divide in Britain as well when you see the rise of the Reform Party, Nigel Farage and others? Are they a sign of the more worrying sign of the times? The battle continues in a sense between liberals and conservatives?
See, economic hardship is one thing, but all across Europe and America, immigration has become a huge issue. And I'm sure that in France, for instance, apart from the blunders that Macron has made in trying to raise the pensioners' age and so on, apart from economic hardship, which certainly does shape politics, this thing about immigration is playing into Donald Trump's hands. It's playing into Le Pen's hands. And so on with Hungary, and very many of the states of the European Union are opposed to immigration, and that is giving a rise to the right wing. People say that the Sunak dismissal and Keir Starmer's election is a move to the left, but it's not necessarily so, because Keir Starmer is as friendly towards the same factors, the idea of growth, the idea of supporting business, whatever the business is, and so on. So Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are not really stalwart left-wingers, even though the left wing of the Labour Party will push for certain reforms, which one looks forward to in Britain. And possibly they trust Keir Starmer more on immigration, because Rishi Sunak's policies on immigration, especially the Rwanda one, has absolutely failed. They haven't sent one person to Rwanda, and they've spent millions of pounds to Rwanda and in their propaganda about it.
In that sense, Sandeep Shastri, while I'm trying to give a world picture of looking at this big election here, because there are many more elections as well to take place in different parts of the world, is there a trend that we can at all pick? Should we look at each election very distinctively to the other? I mentioned incumbency at the start, incumbent governments under notice, but there are other issues of nationalism, cultural divides, that also immigration, that also are playing an important role in widening fault lines within societies. Even in India, we've had this debate between the nature of politics. Rahul Gandhi is pushing much more left-of-centre politics. Mr. Modi pushing much harder right-wing politics. Is that still a factor you believe that's playing out there?
Rajdeep, I think there is a range of similarities which we will see in terms of electoral verdicts, though of course I must hasten to add that I am not trying to make a generalization. There are specificities with regard to every election. But if you look at the general trend, vote against the performance deficit of the regime in power is something that we are seeing around the world. And that performance deficit is in terms of the economy. The performance deficit is in terms of the service delivery which is expected of the government. That performance deficit is in terms of the way different scandals have emerged in societies. And if you look across the world, and especially if you look at Europe, the whole debate on the role of the far right, the whole debate on immigration, be it Poland, be it Denmark, be it Slovakia, be it Germany, be it France, and be it the recent EU elections, you see this common thread across elections where you see this expression of public dissatisfaction with the performance of government, be it economy, be it immigration, be it probity with regard to the performance and the work done by leaders, or the question of service delivery. I think there is this common thread of connectivity that is there. However, I would add, there are specificities in each of these countries which add on to the challenges of those in power.
In fact, those specificities, Daniel Block, in the United States is significant because, as we've been saying, this is an economy which is doing very well. And yet there is a sense, perhaps, is it the age factor, or is it simply, again, some level of a cultural divide that the Trumpians have tapped into? And so despite the fact that he's been indicted at different times, they're still standing by him. Is that is United States in a way sui generis, very distinct to what we are seeing in the rest of the world?
I mean, I think as people were saying, there are similarities and there are differences. And immigration, as people brought up, it's an enormous issue in the United States, and it's one that plays into Trump's hand. Polls routinely show that voters trust Donald Trump and the Republicans more on immigration than they trust the Democrats. In addition, there are cultural issues here that are different from immigration. There's abortion, which in theory should play into the Democrats' hands and does help them in particular cases. There's also issues around the rights of the LGBTQ community. So there's a kind of a whole stew of factors that are at play in the United States, which really cut in different directions. And yet I keep coming back to this fact that the incumbent government is just unpopular. And it was unpopular in 2020. We now have more than kind of 6 years where the incumbent government has done poorly, to the point where we may actually go from the current incumbent government back to another one. It's really hard to put your finger on any one particular force that's at work in the United States in terms of why the current government is unpopular. But it is. And I do think inflation, immigration, and different cultural issues really are at the core. But we may see if Biden steps down, whether it has a lot to do with the person of Biden himself and his age.
Which leads me to a final point, Navteej Sarna. A couple of years ago, the world thought this was the age of the strong man. You need these strong leaders who come in and say, I'm going to set the system right. Almost coming in from the outside, the so-called outsider netas. Narendra Modi was also seen to be a prototype of that kind of a neta. Is that all slowly shifting? People are saying, look, we want someone who will handle all our basic issues. Show us the direction, particularly to solving our economic hardships. Seems to be a running theme across the world, if anything.
You know, I think you're right. I mean, there is a strongman syndrome which is running across the world. Ultimately, it depends upon what the strongman is delivering and what the government is delivering. What people are looking for, essentially, for instance, is in the United Kingdom today, and I'm just drawing from that because that's happened today, is stability, is predictability. And it depends how the government is delivering that. People are looking at that daily stuff happening. Of course, there are fundamental issues. The United States, if I can go back to that for a moment, is already locked into two blocks. I mean, there are the issues that have been mentioned, whether it's inflation, abortion, immigration, etc. They have all been baked in, as the Americans say. The issue is only a few swing states. And there it matters as to how many you can pull in there onto one side or the other. And that's the American system of the way that works. So I think ultimately there are ideological battles going on. There are personality issues, and there are issues of governance. And the issues of public accountability in terms of scandals, etc. So I'm afraid that you would have to see each election in its own specificity, given a approach. We are living in an age where countries are driving away from a sort of overall cooperative situation into a more competitive situation.
Therefore, very quickly, Sandeep Shastri, what is the one thing or two things that you think Narendra Modi has done right, that he's been able to, in a way, offset 10 years of anti-incumbency? Yes, his party came down by 63 seats, but he's in government. Is that more due to the lack of trust in the opposition, or the fact that he enjoys far greater popularity than even his MPs and his party even now?
Rajdeep, today's election or the election we had a month ago proves one important point. Electoral contests are essentially perception battles. It is about the voters' perception on how a leader performs. It is about the voters' perception of what a government delivers. If the Indian Constitution became a critical factor in certain states, if the fear of amending the Constitution, if somebody had 400 plus, became a factor in certain states, if the strength of the leadership and the charisma of leadership became a critical factor in certain states, it is all about perception. And I would also believe that the UK verdict today is about a perception battle. The perception about the Conservatives not being able to deliver, a perception about the need for change. And I think in that sense, the verdict in India a month ago and the verdict here now has a lot of similarities in terms of how voters went out and exercised their franchise.
Very, very interesting conversation with four fine minds. I appreciate Farrukh Dhondy, Navtej Sarna, Sandeep Shastri, Daniel Block for joining me. As we've said, not easy to draw parallels when you have so many elections taking place across the world. Each election must be located in its own specificity, but there are some trends that are slowly but surely emerging in this big election year across the world. Thanks so much to all my guests for joining me on the show tonight.
Thank you.